and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're clear hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
Jim, I have a question.
Mike, I have an answer.
Are you sure? What if you didn't have an answer, actually?
I would make something up like that.
You just pull it right out of your butt.
Given what you know about me, you know I'm going to make some shit up.
What's a slapsgiving?
Oh, slapsgiving. It's a reference to How I Met Your Mother, right? Where one of the protagonists was going to slap the shit out of one of the other protagonists over some slight. And he did like a countdown, like, hey, it's coming. You don't know when, but it's coming. And so as we record this, we are in the immediate wake of the Houthi slapsgiving. So over the last 2 months-ish, the Houthi rebels in western Yemen have been lobbing rockets and missiles and bombs and guns and arrows and speedboats at international shipping that's going through the Red Sea up through the Suez Canal, through the Bab Strait. And we have been warning them, we, America, have been warning them over and over. And then the international community, about 14, 15 countries, warned them over and over and over. Knock that off or things will happen. And it turns out 27 times that was the magic number before we sent a slap their way. And you know what? Props to them. That didn't stop them. The very next day they shot a missile and then we sent another slap their way today. So Good. As we record this, we're on slap number 2. Pacha. And we got a lot more slaps where that came from.
You done fucked up, Aaron.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I look at the Middle East, I try real hard not to like oversimplify it, right? There's a lot of players, a lot of culture, a lot of interests and history and language, all kinds of things. But I think Iran, which appears to be kind of at the center of a lot of the troubles happening in Central Asia right now, I think they wildly underestimate just how many cruise missiles we have. I think they just don't know how big that slapsgiving is.
Like, how many fucks do you think we give is the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you mess with my gas prices, yeah. Slapsgiving. What are we going to talk about tonight?
Yeah, so on to more serious academic nerdy things, because that's a thing that we do. One of the things that we've talked on this show a lot about is some of the parallels that we can steal from aviation and law enforcement and medicine as it relates to things like decision-making, communication, and teamwork. And there was a little while back...
And it's important, I want to point out, we're not trying to make cops airline pilots, right?
Of course.
And we're not trying to make airline pilots into cops.
Right.
However, if there's one or two little like good lessons, good like ways of doing business that we can yoink from one community and sprinkle on the other community, goodness comes from that.
For sure. And I have noticed that just when I use those three industries as an example, aviation, medicine, and law enforcement, the price of admission, like in terms of like investment of time and qualifications and education and all of that, for law enforcement is the lowest. And I feel like at times it shows. Now, I only have a high school diploma. I don't have a college education. So I can't sit here in good faith and advocate for higher level education because I don't know that education is necessarily the fix there. But maybe the research and some of the data collection and some of that goes into what makes aviation and medicine the practices that they are, like some of that could probably be useful in law enforcement. So we've used aviation examples for law enforcement stuff for a long time, and it's easy to do when I have a co-host who's a pilot, right? But there was a while back that I did an episode by myself. Jim was deployed or something, killing bad guys or doing whatever it is that he does. And I talked about some aviation examples that human factors played a role. And one in particular was American Airlines Flight 587. If you search American Airlines 587, you'll come across this. There's a Wikipedia page and tons of articles about it. There's videos. And this is where a passenger aircraft was taking off behind another plane. It encountered wake turbulence. Jim, you want to give us the basis?
Yeah, so when we say wake turbulence, we're not talking about like, oh, it's bumpy. We're talking about the wingtip vortices and the unstable air that happens after a plane flies through it. And we used to call it jet wash. It's not technically from the exhaust. It's more from like the action of air over wings. And once we made very high lift wings, like what you'd see on like the biggest airliners and the long ranges, and especially once we put those little like winglets on them, they really spin up the air behind them. And they spin it up so much that you can actually flip an airplane upside down if it flies through it or behind it. And I've seen that happen. I actually had a crash in Afghanistan where a smaller plane got in the wake vortices or wake turbulence of a bigger airplane and flipped upside down and killed the crew. So it's no joke. And avoiding it is mostly a factor of timing. You just kind of get some space between you and the plane taking off, timing and distance, and let the wind kind of blow it away.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Straightforward enough. And obviously air traffic controllers were aware of this thing. And in this particular crash, the pilot, essentially what the investigation revealed was the guy flying the airplane, who was the first officer in this case, overreacted to wake turbulence. And he caused a critical mechanical failure. Essentially, he broke the rudder off of the airplane by overcompensating, over-adjusting, overreacting in the controls, and the plane crashed and a whole bunch of people died. And one of the things they said specifically in the investigation was that if instead the pilot did nothing, like took his hands off the controls, basically, is like how I read it, it probably would have been avoided altogether, which is kind of crazy, right? So there's a lot at play here. There's some evidence that was discussed that talks about how like maybe the pilot had some history or trauma or bad experiences from wake turbulence that made him a little bit jumpy or led him to overreact to this kind of thing. He was also working with another pilot, and that's a lot of that dynamic between him and the other pilot is what we're going to talk about. But he was working with another pilot who might or might not have been able to intervene. I'm not sure. But what I want to narrow our focus to, as far as this episode goes, has to do with the communication between the two at the time of the event. So when the aircraft was cleared for departure, the tower told them, hey, you're clear for takeoff. Just be aware of wake turbulence, because like this 747 full of people just took off ahead of them. So they gave them like a heads up. Just, hey, just letting you know, right?
Caution wake turbulence.
Yeah.
Yep. And usually you hack a clock, you give it about 2 minutes, and then you get cleared to take off.
Yeah. See, that's my understanding at least. And so in the cockpit voice recordings, there was transcripts of the two guys communicating, and the first officer, who was the one actually piloting the aircraft during takeoff, he asks his captain, the other pilot, so you happy with that distance? The distance between them and the other plane. And the captain was like, yeah, once we get rolling, we'll be all right. Once we're airborne, we'll be far enough behind it. He's like, yeah, it'll be fine. And the FO goes, so you're happy?
As long as you're happy, everything's fine. Like your happiness, that's really what drives this train, is your happiness.
Yeah. So we know the outcome of the event. So they take off. They hit wake turbulence, which at some distance, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, if it's dissipated and you've given it enough time, like it might be a little bumpy, but it's fine, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah. So you hit some wake turbulence. It's like not the end of the world. So he gets in this and he starts to overreact, and essentially breaks the plane, and they crash and a bunch of people die. Right? If you want to go check out the stuff that I've talked about it before, it's episode 48. It was back in the day. It's a long time ago.
Back in the day, you get to hear like high quality audio.
It probably sucks.
Yeah.
But if you want to learn about the event specifically and deep dive some of that, you can. Episode 48. But importantly, the interpersonal communication that I want to narrow in on for this episode, when he asks, so you're happy with that distance? It's like, well, yeah, it'll be all right. And like, so you're happy, right? This is a good example of what some people have referred to as a concept called mitigated speech. And this is a core concept in decision-making and problem solving, specifically as it relates to working in teams.
So the funny thing about that statement, the co-pilot or the first officer made, the "Are you happy?" Depending on the tone he used, it sounds a lot to me like a flight instructorism. It sounds like when you're screwing up an approach, and the flight instructor's like, "So, how's this approach look?
How you feeling about that?
how's it going?" And you know that's an instructorism, and it's a thing flight instructors say to students to kind of clue them in about what right looks like and what wrong looks like. And you know, ultimately, the captain of the plane is the captain of the plane. There's a reason why we call them that, and why the FAA calls them that, and why the Air Force calls them that, because he is the final authority on whether you take off or not, right? But we all die at the same time. When we're on the plane, we all have an interest in getting that right. You mean? So, you know, even if the captain gives you permission to die, that doesn't mean you take it. And so, you know, the co-pilot probably wasn't explicitly instructed to say words, "Are you happy?" or "Are you happy with that distance?" But it was probably a speech pattern that was modeled for him by like half of his flight instructors. I don't know if he's prior military or civilian. It doesn't matter. I've had both say words like that to me. So comms are always a debrief item in like every critical event, every combat operation, every exercise in the history of like fighting. Okay. A lot of the time that comes off as like a technical thing. Oh, the radios were garbage, or the encryption didn't work, or the anti-jam didn't work, or the computers went down. But you know what? More often, like way more often, it's like that words are hard. And words mean things, and we use the wrong ones at the wrong time. And when people stress out, and they drop their IQ points when they stress out, one of the very first things that most people lose is the ability to talk good. So, Mike, you said some funny words earlier, like, what is it? Mayonnaise speak or micturated talking or some shit. Like, what was that?
Yeah. Mitigated speech.
Sounded like nerd
speech.
Talk to me.
It is nerd talk.
Nerd talk.
I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
So, to be clear, mitigated speech in this particular event wasn't necessarily the cause or the fault of anything, right? But I think it's a good example, because really what that guy was trying to say was that he didn't feel comfortable with the distance between the aircraft and and them for takeoff.
Exactly.
And it wouldn't have been like a big deal to just be like, hey, why don't we just like give it another minute? In that communication, you can kind of see like, hey, so are you happy with that distance? Like, oh yeah, it should be fine. Like, so you're happy then, right? This is, I think, a good example of mitigated speech. Mitigated speech is defined as speech that is either indirect or deferential, usually to like an authority figure or someone in a position of authority. And there's varying degrees of mitigation. And a lot of us mitigate speech because it's just polite or it's like appropriate for the environment. We're trying to soften, we're not trying to be like overly direct or overly, we don't want to come across as a dick, right? That's okay in a lot of cases, right? It's polite, it's more democratic, but sometimes it's also ambiguous and inefficient. And there's some research about this. If you want to read more about it, some of the research is summarized in a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. But in essence, they talk about 6 levels or variations of mitigated speech. The top of the food chain is a command, right? Turn 30 degrees right. It is the most direct and explicit way of making a point. There's no mitigation there. It's just, max power or, whatever it is that would happen between a pilot and a co-pilot, for example.
Get off the damn rudders.
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever it is, right? It's a command. It's very direct and very clear. The next level is like a crew obligation statement. This is something where you say something like you feel compelled to give your input, right? I think we need to deviate right about now. And there's like the use of the word we in there, right? It's a request. It's a little bit less specific. It's a little softer. So crew obligation, I feel compelled to speak up. I'm not commanding you to do it, but I feel the need to say something, right? The next level is more of a suggestion. Hey, maybe we should go around that weather. And the implicit feeling or statement behind that is like, we're in this together. Like, hey, I think we should probably do X, Y, or Z. It's a suggestion, right? The next one is a query or more of a question, right? I'm suggesting something to you, but I'm making it sound like a question. And this is kind of what you saw in this example of like, you happy with that distance? Again, there's more behind that, right? So a query might be like, what direction would you like to go, right? It's softer than a suggestion.
So there's some funny things about which direction would you like to go. That's choice shaping. I'm telling you, you're going to deviate. Do you want to go left or do you want to go right? My wife does this to my kids all the time. You can put on your left shoe or your right shoe, but guess what? You're putting on some shoes right now, right? It's a kind of a directive question. That's a little literary foreshadowing.
Yeah. So it's softer than a suggestion. And the thing about this one is the speaker is making clear that they're not in charge, that they're not the ones that are making the decision. They're just saying like, hey, what do you think about this kind of thing? Then there's a preference. Like, hey, I think it would be a good idea if we did left or right, or, generally speaking, I feel like we should do X, Y, or Z. It's just a preference in a very soft way that's maybe not specific or directly applied to the scenario at hand. It's just kind of like, hey, what about this? Like, And then the last one is a hint. The lowest or the highest level of mitigation, the least direct way of speaking would be like a hint. And be like, oh man, that cloud out there, if I'm a pilot, if I was a pilot, I'm not a pilot, but like, man,
how's that cloud look?
That thunderstorm over there looks nasty. That looks mean, right? And that statement is like super mitigated. It's not saying like there's a significant storm ahead, we should probably avoid it. It's saying like, man, that storm looks pretty wild, huh? It's just kind of dropping a hint, right? It's not very direct. So those are some examples of mitigated speech.
Okay, mitigated speech. Like talking, but you're trying to soften. Okay, I got it. So in an English lit class for the military officer nerds, we call that a euphemism in a lot of cases. Like, your aunt didn't die, she passed away. Or instead of telling kids in a classroom to get their pencils out, you ask it like a question, like, would you like to get your pencils out? So it's a nicer way of talking, a softer way of leading. And isn't that usually like a good thing? I got taught that a lot in leadership training. Like, instead of commanding, maybe, make it more democratic. Instead of being Captain, I'm going to mess this up. Instead of being Captain Kirk, you want to be Captain Picard. That was a thing I was literally taught in military training. I'm not a Star Wars expert.
No one in the audience remembers that
Yeah.
shit.
Yeah. I'm not a Star Wars expert. I think one had a Wookiee and one had like one of them little like Jabba the Hutt things. I don't know.
Don't even remember. But and we're going to talk about like this does relate heavily into leadership as well. And the trick is, if you're going to try to soften it or make it democratic, it's actually got to be democratic. But we'll talk about that later. So when it comes to tactical settings and really where rubber meets road on mitigated speech, we'll go through some examples.
Or where airplane meets mountain.
Yeah, watch out for that.
Yeah.
So let's use the aviation example of how like an in-flight emergency would go, right? Like a plane might say like whatever their call sign is, ABC 123 declaring an emergency. They would say that to an air traffic controller, and that leaves no question whatsoever that something is happening in the sky that the air traffic controller can't see. ABC 123 declaring an emergency. No question, right? If instead a pilot was to say, hey, we seem to be having some trouble up here, like long pause, and then the air traffic controller is left wondering and needs to ask like 20 questions. Like, okay, so what do you need? Do you need a runway, like an airport? Do you need altitude? Do you just need a few minutes? Like, what are we looking at?
Do you need a hug? Yeah. So in my experience, and I've seen that many, many times, this is often a symptom of normalcy bias. And sort of like those psychological coping phases, like denial, acceptance, grief, anger, whatever. Because if you do declare an emergency, you have to admit you've got a problem.
You've pushed the red button. Yeah.
And admitting you have a problem is often the first step to solving it, I'm told. I have actually seen this, like I said, in real life several times. So what I'd offer on this is not only is it inefficient communication, it's a sign the pilot is in bad headspace and kind of needs to get shaken out of it a little bit. You may need to give him or her permission to call it what it is. Hey, you know what? It costs us nothing to declare the emergency. We get better handling.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is some of this is just straight up decision making. And you definitely see this mitigated speech problem come up when one person perceives a problem and the other one like hasn't caught on. And this is something where using air traffic control, this is a good example of a good air traffic controller. I've listened to a lot of like recordings of in-flight emergencies where the air traffic controllers were absolutely the rock stars. And sometimes like they're able to get the pilot in that headspace, like Jim is saying, like they can either snap him out of it or get him on track, ask the right question that goes like, oh, okay, I have a procedure for this. Give them, in a sense, like some hope, right? But even in that,
or taking over. Hey, we're declaring an emergency for you, which they're allowed to do.
Yeah, that's neat. I didn't know that. But in some cases, like maybe the pilot co-pilot situation, one of them perceives a problem and one of them didn't catch it for whatever reason, right? So there's a decision making component to this by itself, and like Jim said, you can't just be like, see, I told you so, or what I meant to say was, or that's not a conversation you're probably going to be able to have when you crash at the Atlantic somewhere or into a mountain or whatever. So
it's a really fun conversation to have in a life raft. Like, that's when we're deciding who to eat. Like, well, hey,
so about this,
it's complicated. I didn't want to overreact. Like, okay, buddy, we're eating you first.
Let's debrief this real quick.
Yeah.
So there's a key distinction in this, and that is that there is individual or personal decision making that occurs in our careers, our professions. And then there's a team-oriented decision-making process where ideally there is some shared consciousness or awareness of the problem. And with that shared consciousness or awareness is also some clue as to its inherent solutions or the direction that we need to go. And when it comes to working in teams, there's a reason that people are working together, right? There's a reason that this is a joint effort in a lot of cases. So where that leads us is decision making gets a lot more complex. In some sense, it is kind of a committee. It is kind of a democracy. On some level, that is true. Right up until...
And I want that, right? I want a team. I want a crew. I want the other guys in my formation to help me make a better decision.
Extra eyes, extra hands, all those things definitely can be helpful, right? And at some point, yes, it is a democracy, right up until it isn't, and everyone needs to get in line. And that's the dynamic we have to kind of work out. So in terms of shared awareness and problem solving, that interpersonal communication piece plays into this quite a bit, and that's why we need to pay attention to it. Speaking of pilot and co-pilot dynamics, Jim can speak to this, obviously, as a high-ranking military officer that he is, distinguished, of course. A junior pilot...
In my own mind.
A junior pilot might be reluctant to point out an error or an oversight because of things like seniority or flight hours or credentials or qualifications or whatever. And so instead of calling it out like it is and being potentially perceived as the hot shot, right, or the know-it-all or something like that, they might mitigate. And they might say just like, hey, just a heads up, I think maybe XYZ, instead of a very clear or direct, I see X, recommend we do Y. This is one of those situations where the leader, right, the senior pilot in a case like this, needs to recognize that dynamic and try to facilitate and encourage that open and clear communication.
And you usually set that up in the briefing, right? You sit down and you say, okay, hey, I realize I'm the wing commander and I own the base and I can crush your skull if I feel like it. But today I'm a rusty pilot because I sit in staff meetings all day. And if I make a mistake, I want you to call me out, right? You set that as a standard in the briefing. And we actually have standards for how much deviation before you're required to say something, how much airspeed or altitude deviation we will tolerate. And we have a term for this phenomenon in flying crew resource management, which is the formal act of learning about how to work in a team for pilots, because pilots don't know how to interact with people real well unless they're taught how to interact with people. We're much better at working with machines, looking at our watches. So we call that halo effect or excessive professional courtesy. And one of the ways you break it is you don't use rank in the cockpit. You don't say sir in the cockpit. And the other way you break it is with the 2 call-out rule. Like, hey, sir, I think we probably ought to climb. And if you don't get a useful response, you get directive. Climb now. And then after that second call-out, and you still don't see a correction, you take the controls. Hey, my aircraft. Hey, we're getting too close to the rocks.
I picture this like tug-of-war match, like, no, it's mine. No, it's mine. No, it's mine.
I've only been in one slap fight in the cockpit. And
hang on, I'm coming over there to choke you out, and then I'll take the airplane.
I'm just saying she had it coming. That's all I have to say about that. Christy's a badass pilot. But another thing I wanted to hit real quick is, Mike earlier mentioned the command and the obligation statement and the suggestion and the query and the preference and the hint. One of the things we do in the Air Force, at least, is we say, there are a couple of magic words. There are a couple of like safe words that if you're getting that pinch where you're sucking the seat cushion up into your butthole and you're like, I don't like this. This is uncomfortable. 1, recognize it. And 2, say some words, right? And it's kind of the magic words are supposed to snap everyone out of it are timeout, which is what you say like, hey, I don't understand what's happening here. Can someone explain this to me? Timeout. What's going on, right? The next is knock it off. Hey, knock it off. This is going down a bad path. Stop. I want to go home. And then the next one is this is stupid. As in like, hey, we're taking off into a thunderstorm. This is stupid.
What
Let's
could possibly
not do
go
this,
wrong?
right? And just, when you feel like we're going down an error chain, break the chain, right? And so those are kind of the magic words of like, hey, strawberries. I don't like this. Right?
Have a safe word.
You guys have that? Throw the safe word out, right?
Yep. You have a safe word?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So we literally brief this every single flight. We say, hey, anybody on the crew can call timeout, knock it off. This is stupid. And that's what we mean by that.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be a Tech Tangents episode if I didn't try to apply some of this to my world. And so in law enforcement, where you see this a lot is like in 911 calls and dispatching sometimes. You'll come across it in just the call typing. When a call taker takes a 911 call and they have to enter this thing in, and I'm not throwing shade at my communications people at all because it's a tough job and they're trying to do the best they can with limited information as well. Like they don't get to go to these things and see what really happens the way I do. So I'm not throwing shade at them whatsoever. We'll talk about that balance as we get a little bit further into this. But I have seen violent home invasions get categorized as like suspicious activity, the most ambiguous possible thing. Like
technically true, but not helpful.
If it wasn't suspicious, it probably wouldn't have generated a 911 call.
There's some shady shit going on over there.
Yeah. Like, so that can mean a billion different things. And at the end user level, you have to anticipate that sometimes that call typing information isn't accurate, and suspicious activity like could be nothing, could be legit. You have to know that going into it, of course. But consider the difference when a dispatcher, for example, gets on the radio and says like, well, we've got a shots heard call, like a high priority shots heard call. Nah, it's, in this area, nothing else seen or heard, versus a call taker or a dispatcher that enters a call or reads a call and says like, this is a possible active shooter. What kind of mindset flip happens in the people responding to that? It's like a big deal, right? So this is not necessarily a speech or a communication example necessarily. It's more of an information and intelligence one in a lot of cases. But the thing is, as humans, we recognize patterns and we start to formulate mental impressions of the situation as we collect that information, right? That's the difference between information and intelligence, is you're layering that analysis to it, right? And your experience and all those things. Where we mitigate is kind of what Jim was saying earlier. We're afraid to push the big red button. We don't want to be that guy that calls it an active shooter and runs in there like it's Fallujah or something and have it be nothing, right? You don't want to call it a hostage situation and be like, well, like you just don't want to be perceived as that dude who had his hair on fire and turned a molehill into a mountain, right? But the thing is, like, if you're thinking about it, if you're thinking it could be this thing, someone else might be thinking that too. And if you're calm about it, you can tailor your response favorably and be like, hey, this is the worst case scenario, X, Y, or Z. And still include some margin of error, right? Like some ability to be like, I could be wrong on this, but we're going to treat it like an active shooter. We're going to treat this like a possible active killer event. Or I could be wrong in this, but until it's ruled out, we're going to treat this like a hostage situation.
So is there an option to say both? Like, can the call taker say, hey, suspicious activity, possible home invasion? That I think that conveys a lot with relatively few words.
Yeah, if suspicious activity is helpful to you at that point, maybe. I mean, anytime there's a suspicious activity call that shows up on the board, I read it because there's got to be more information, right? As opposed to if I see a call for armed robbery, like I'll read the call to get the additional details, but I already know what it is from the outset. Or suspicious activity, I'm like, okay, well, I have to read that one to know anything about it, right? So yeah, you could say that, right? I don't know that the suspicious activity part is necessarily helpful. It's the possible. It's leaving yourself that out for like, it sounds like a home invasion. Maybe it's not. I don't know. So this is delicate because I don't necessarily want call takers and dispatchers to get too creative about some of this when they're making an interpretation. At some point, like they need to include just the facts, right? Like they just enter what the caller is telling you and we'll figure it out from there. But at the same time, there's a lot that they can't convey in that typed out like short form text that they're typing while they're talking on the phone. The tone of voice, the background noise, just like their feeling about the credibility of the caller. Some of that is not easy to convey in that typed, like, formal, brief call text. So this is tricky because, like, I've seen it go both ways. They'll enter a call as something like possibly serious, and then it ends up like, nah, that doesn't sound like, why don't you just pump the brakes on that one? It's probably not. And I've seen it the other way too, where it's entered as like something low level, and you're like, we should probably ramp that up a little bit, right? And this is why it's good to have a lot of people, like, hands in the pot, like eyes and ears on the problem, is because you can start to ask those questions and fix it, right? Catch those errors. So where all that leads us is like, yeah, I want to empower and enable the communication staff to layer that assessment and interpretation into the stuff that they're doing. But there's got to be a balance, right? There's got to be some favorable way of making sure that that we're hedging our errors in the favor of public safety, not the other way around. So not necessarily mitigated speech, but you can see where, in the same sense, if someone doesn't want to push that red button, right, they can still mitigate. They can be listening to a call. They can get callous. They can get cynical, right? They take a billion calls a day, every day at work, and they go to enter this stuff into the computer, and they can mitigate stuff. And we have to watch out for that. Not just a communications or dispatch problem, though, by any stretch. We also see this just in the response to things. And part of it is on the radio, we say, like, hey, just, like, don't be such a dick on the radio. Well, okay. Like, we're going to one of these calls and we're trying to communicate something briefly and clearly and accurately. And those are humans with feelings on the other side and all of that, right? But it's a radio, not a telephone, for a reason. So it's easy to be like, well, don't be a dick. But also, if you're too indirect, it becomes unclear. And that's part of the problem.
End your radio transmission with like a little smile emoji. Obviously you don't want to be a dick on the radio, but you do have to balance that with being ABC, right? Accurate, brief, and clear. And this is ultimately about efficiency and effectiveness over manners. And that's a challenge. And it's kind of a game. You're trying to convey as much useful information as you can in as little airtime as you can, but not so brief that the receiver can't understand you and has to ask a bunch of follow-up questions. When we talk about how long should a briefing be, we say, well, it should be like a skirt. Long enough to cover everything, short enough to be interesting. Okay? For me, this is about understanding the guy or the gal on the other end of the radio. What words does he need to hear? And in what order and in what tone in order to react the way you need him to? One of the most important things in tactical everything is communications, and it's one of the things we practice the least. You go out to the range, you blast, 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 and maybe you rehearse the post-blast radio call. Shots fired. Officer needs assistance. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Do you need my assistance? Over. Farva. Whatever. Like, that one radio call, you probably have rehearsed a bunch, right? But what about all the other talking you have to do? What about all the other radio calls you have to do, and the ones you have to do in a time compressed way? Maybe you should rehearse those. Maybe on the drive into work while you're listening to a cool podcast like ours. Also, practice a couple of radio calls. Talk to yourself a little bit. Make the words come out. Okay? Always remember the phrase, push to talk, not to think. Once you key the mic, you need to get the words out efficiently. And I don't know how police radios are, but I know with military radios, there's usually like a second or two of like beeping because of encryption and network architecture. They have to go find Santa Claus and then connect. That's called a preamble. That's the term we use. That's there to help you a little bit. Stop, breathe, gather your thoughts, key the mic, wait for the preamble, send your traffic in a predictable format. So like in flying, we have relatively consistent formats for how we make radio calls. Generally speaking, in flying, whether I'm flying a Cessna or an F-35 or a B-2 or a drone, I say the words who I'm calling, who I am, so it's backwards from police, where I am, and what I want. So that sounds like Luke Tower, Panther 5-5, 10-mile final, runway 3 left, option radar. And what I'm saying is, the big Air Force base in Phoenix, Panther 5-5, that's who I am. I'm 10 miles from the runway, lined up for runway 3 left, and I'm looking to get an option. So either do a touch and go or a full stop landing. And then after that touch and go, I want to go back to the radar pattern and talk to approach control. Okay. And so I convey a lot of information in as few words as I can. And they're expecting that, and they're expecting those words in that order, right? The tower. So Luke Tower, Panther 5-5, 10-mile final, runway 3 left, option radar. If I say that in a different order, it's going to take the tower controller an extra couple of seconds to figure out what the hell I just said. Or if I say it way too fast. Or if he's like eating a sandwich and it's a quiet day, and then all of a sudden all that comes in on the radio. I'm going to have to say it all again, and then I didn't save myself anything, right? Or what if I key the mic and I inject some verbal tick? And a lot of people do this. They have these like verbal crutches that they use. So key the mic. Luke Tower, like Panther 5-5, be advised at this time passing, and of course by that time, you're not at 10 miles, you're at 7.5 miles. So passing 7.5 miles for the runway, because you don't know which fucking runway you're lined up on. Gear down, looking for the option. How many seconds was that transmission? And did I convey as much information as efficiently as the first one? I might have sounded friendlier, but I also sounded incompetent. So consider that. Predictable formats help a lot. They cue you cognitive. We talk about cognitive priming on this show. Every instrument clearance is given in the format of climb, turn, talk, squawk. So you don't have to write half of it down because you already know that's the order, right? So say I'm down in Tucson at the big air base in Tucson, Davis-Monthan, and I ask for a instrument clearance to get up to Luke. They will more or less always give it, and it's been a while since I've flown out of there. It'll sound something like King 6-9er, Davis-Monthan ground, so who I'm calling, who I am. You are cleared to Luke as filed on departure. Climb 2000, expect 13,000, 10 minutes later, heading 350, contact departure 125.1, squawk 7700. The first time you get a clearance like that, you're like, what? Okay, just repeat everything you just said.
10-9 over.
Yeah, I got everything up to King. And they're like, oh, you're new here. Okay.
All right,
King
buddy, let me slow it down for you, okay?
Davis-Monthan ground. And then they're like, okay, he's obviously disabled. You are cleared to Luke as filed. On departure, climb 2000, expect 13,000, 10 minutes later, heading 350, contact departure 125.1, squawk 7700. And if you don't already know the order that's going to come in, you're sitting there writing with the words like heading, squawk, contact, but it's always going to come at you as climb, turn, talk, squawk. Always. Okay. And for that reason. And then once you get that format, you can rattle it off like it's nothing. Same way with like close air support requests, 9 lines and 5 lines, or medevac requests, medevac 9 line. And it's more than just a t-shirt with flags on it. Like 9 lines are 9 lines for a reason. That's the order that you need in order to get a medevac helicopter or rescue helicopter to you. For law enforcement, does your agency have a standard for how you describe a guy or a car? Or does everyone say it kind of different? And if not, I would offer, yeah, you probably should. But here's the thing about standards and like brevity codes, like, don't get so hung up on the code words and the brevity that you gum up the radios. Like when in doubt, just speak in plain English.
Use your words. Yep.
If it's more efficient to just talk plain words, use plain words. We'll figure it out later. Okay.
Yeah. Like in law enforcement, we have symbol for like cars, CYMBL. So color, year, make, body style, license plate, right?
So what does that sound like? You see some hoopty car driving down the road and you call.
It'd be like a silver early 2000s Toyota Tacoma pickup, license plate, Arizona, ABC 123, something like that, right? Color, year, make, body style, license plate. Symbol, CYMBL. Anyway, so yeah, one thing I've noticed in law enforcement that we struggle with a lot is incident command. And in contrast, I compare us a lot to the fire service and EMS, partly because I came from that as a background, but also because in public safety, those are kind of the branches, right? In law enforcement, though, our nature is very kind of maverick.
Top Gun.
And what I mean by that is like we are expected to do a lot of things solo. And for example, working on a SWAT team is very different than just being like a patrol, like a beat cop, right? And it's not to say that you don't work with other people, because you do, right? But if you light a car up and you're on a traffic stop, a lot of times you're by yourself. You have to manage every part of that problem by yourself until help arrives. So working on a SWAT team versus in a patrol situation is a very different experience. And some people are better at one or the other. But in a patrol aspect, it's really easy to fall into this trap where everyone is working as individuals. There's individual efforts. There's no harmony. We're out of sync. Unlike the fire service, where there's a captain, an engineer, and maybe we'll say 2 firefighters. Right? There's an established incident command structure built into that from the get-go. Sure, we have like sergeants and lieutenants in law enforcement, but a lot of times like they're not taking over until they get there, which is going to be way after everybody else. So we run into issues when we don't have a clearly defined incident command structure on these events. And it's tricky culturally when on one call, you might run the show, and then on the next call, your buddy might run the show, right? Because we are theoretically just peers. We're equals, really, but we tend to compare ourselves with each other as peers even. And this is where we really struggle sometimes with like when to lead and when to follow. So if one person starts calling the shots, but then the senior guys just blow that guy off and I don't care what he says, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Or if the junior guy is trying to take charge and trying to take incident command and the senior guys are steamrolling them, right? You run into these issues. Then you get lots of different directions. People get out of sync and we lose traction to get control of the event. And this is where something like avoiding mitigated speech could be part of the solution.
One thing I want to hit is directive questions. I mentioned this earlier. This is that concept of like the teacher asking kids in class, like, would you like to take out your pencils? When what she means is take out your pencils. So there are a couple different ways to look at this. Pretty universally, people would rather be asked than told. That's a thing in leadership. It's a thing in verbal judo, ask, tell, make, whatever. The problem arises with cross-cultural communication, and not even across like global cultures. You see this across socioeconomic cultures, demographic subcultures, even within a city. And that method doesn't work real well with someone who's real agitated also. So not even just a cultural thing, but more like a frame of mind thing. Directive questions are the polite way of telling someone what to do in a certain segment of society. Close your eyes and picture what an elementary school teacher in America looks like and sounds like. Whatever stereotype you have of that, that's the demographic that directive questions are. Okay.
Careful.
And that they were brought up with. For another segment of society, directive questions are totally meaningless. So in that classroom example, say you have a kid who answers no, or just straight ignores the teacher. Is that kid being defiant? Well, yeah, kinda. They sure aren't like with you. They aren't in the program, but they might also just be taking you literally. Would you like to take your pencil out? No, I would not like to take my pencil out.
Not really, actually.
No, actually, no. This led to some interesting conversations between my wife and I about would I like to empty the dishwasher? I was like, no, I don't want to empty the dishwasher. I'll still do it, but I don't want to.
Is that knocked up? Why would I want to do the dishes?
Yeah.
I want you to want to do the dishes.
Yeah. So I'm just a literalist at the end of the day, right? So no, they don't want to get out their pencil. What they want to do is hit the kid next to them with their notebook, because that's what's fun for them right now. Okay. So you might have to read the room. You might have to read that particular kid. And instead of using a directive question with that kid, you might have to be a lot more straightforward. Tommy, get your pencil out. A lot of our mitigated speech doesn't translate well through language barriers, and doesn't translate well when the receiver is just amped up on adrenaline, drugs, whatever, right? Short, clear commands are way better than long soliloquies. The guy doesn't need a podcast episode on why empty hands are important. He needs to stop walking and show you his hands, right? That's a law enforcement thing. That's a military thing. When I'm trying to get someone to snap out of it a little bit, I'm not going to ask them a question.
Yeah.
Like if I see that they're in the right headspace, maybe I will. Like, hey, how does this approach look? I might do that. But if I can tell their hair is on fire, I'm not going to be like, hey, how does this approach look? I'm going to say, you're 100 feet low. You're a dot low. My controls. Right?
I really love the the kid example, because from the parenting perspective, like I have a 4-year-old, and
would you like to go to bed? No.
Don't give them the option.
I want mom right now.
Don't give them the option if you don't expect the alternative, right? Like his 4-year-old checkup, we took him to the doctor, and they were going to do something. I think it was like get on the scale, or maybe they were going to listen to his heart with the stethoscope, something like that. And they're like, would you like to do X? I'm like, don't ask him if he can't say no. Like, tell him this is what's going to happen, right? Yep. They're mitigating, though. They're trying to be approachable to the kid. They're trying to be friendly and polite. But it's the problem with it in this case is we're going to do it anyway. It's indirect, right? So as it relates to things like problem solving in a team environment, team setting, we need everyone to have a common picture of the problem, and not only the problem, but also the available options. And there's a lot of experienced people in these tactical type of environments who are seeing things that maybe like the experienced guys are seeing things that maybe the new guys aren't. And at the same time, the new guys might have some like wild idea that actually is pretty good and prompt a good direction. And we won't get that idea out there if we don't encourage them to speak up. So in team settings, I need people not to mitigate. Go ahead and speak up. There's a level of mitigation that might be appropriate. Maybe it is a question or suggestion, but you just need to recognize if you're seeing something that's jacked up, right? So if we are doing a takedown of a bad guy in a parking lot of an open business, and there's a school bus that happens to unload right as this takedown's about to happen, and the new guy goes like, hey, Sarge, just a heads up, there's no, like that might be a scenario where you're like, there's a school bus with a bunch of school children in the parking lot, abort. Like, and you just call it, right? Like you have to have essentially the balls to not mitigate that, right? Or at the very least, you can mitigate less and you could say, school bus unloading to the south, I recommend we abort, right? It's more direct. You're acknowledging it's not your decision, but your recommendation and your interpretation is very clear. Another example I saw a lot of this of in terms of teamwork and problem-solving dynamics is when I worked on an ambulance with a paramedic. I'm just an EMT, so that's a level below paramedic, right? And one thing that I learned working with good paramedics is that we're in a good spot to keep them grounded. There are paramedics out there who I worked with that had a chip on their shoulder, and they had this attitude that like the EMT is just the driver. You know, your job is to take vital signs and drive, like clean the gurney. That's it. And they want you to stay in this like narrow lane. And because, man, they are smart. Like, they are so cool, paramedics and all. But the good ones recognize that they are sometimes so busy thinking about the advanced stuff, reading EKGs and medication doses and drip rates. They're thinking about all this stuff that they really lean on their EMT to remind them, like, hey, why don't we start thinking about transporting, like in a big hurry? What this guy needs is diesel, bright lights and cold steel. Let's get to the hospital. How about that? And or it might just be like something straightforward. Hey, I'm noticing an airway problem. So having some of this little communication stuff worked out, it gives you better teamwork. Like, this is a medium for better teamwork and better problem solving. You want this environment where people are encouraged to offer input and speak up. That's a good thing.
Yeah, in flying, we one of the crew resource management issues we run into is passenger syndrome. Like, oh, well, he's in charge, he's got it. It's kind of related to that halo effect thing, right? I do not want followers. I want assertive followers. I want guys who are trying to help solve the problem with me, right?
Yeah. Where you can kind of facilitate and encourage that culture where people are willing to speak up and avoid mitigating is in your debriefs. We've done entire episodes on debriefs, and it applies just as much here. Good debriefs are those where there are no holds barred, no one is safe, rank and egos are left at the door.
Yeah, I want to jump in on the rank and egos are left at the door. I was working with a young airman once, and he had heard that general gist about debriefs, and he's like, "Yeah, I can call a colonel a fuckface if I want." And I'm like, so there's limits, right? Like, you still need to be professional, and rank doesn't matter right up until it does, but you still have an obligation to the organization, and you have an obligation to that other teammate, no matter what their rank is, if they're messing up, to tell them, right? And there's a nice way to do it. There's a professional way to do it. You might do it in private, rather than embarrassing them in front of the crew. But you still have to do it. You have an obligation to do it.
Yeah, and so the thing to note about that is, notice that we didn't say mutual respect and maturity and good communicating were left at the door. Ranks and egos, nope. That's one thing. But you still need to be respectful. You still need to be mature, right? It's one thing if there's conflict, we can work that out. Communicate well. Don't let your ego or your temper get the best of you. But you can facilitate a lot of this, like avoiding mitigated speech in your debriefs. And that doesn't mean that every conversation or confrontation has to happen in the debrief. There's a time and a place to address things privately, and that's separate than mitigated speech. But just understand that culturally, this is where you're going to see a lot of that stuff pop up. Which leads us into the leadership implications of mitigated speech. When I was getting this outline together, one of the things, I read a quote on the internet, and it said basically, as it relates to mitigated speech, it says, if you want your boss to do you a favor, and you say something like, don't bother if it's too much trouble, but if you have a chance to look this over the weekend, that would be great. As opposed to, I really need this by Monday to meet this deadline. Which one is more clear, right? So when it comes to leadership stuff, you want that subordinate level guy to be able to say like, hey, to make this happen, I need X, instead of mitigating. Well, if it's too much trouble, like, kind of meek. But if you get a chance, that would be great, right? This applies in leadership just as much as it does in decision making.
Yeah. Social awareness is important. This is a read the room thing. Some people will only receive if you give it in mitigated speech. That is their reception language, if you will. Otherwise, it feels to them like you're barking at them.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that I have had to learn over time because I tend to be very, very direct. And then some people will totally disregard mitigated speech. It's sort of like, would you like to take out your pencil? No, I wouldn't. Whack, whack, whack with the notebook, right?
Next question.
Yeah. And this is leadership. Leadership is reading the people around you, figuring out what motivates them, what language they need to hear things in, what's their love language, what's their language of apology,
How to
what's their
effectively
language of
communicate,
command.
for sure.
Yeah. And that's the game. But here's the thing. It has real tactical impact. When you're telling someone to get out of the car, there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. And you have to read them to figure out what right is in that moment.
As far as this goes back to I'll use the parenting example. Don't give them an option if there's not an option. And this has happened a lot of times on traffic stops where you're like, hey, get out of the car. And you go, hey, sir, would you mind stepping out of the car? And they go, as a matter of fact, I would mind. Right? You mitigate because you're trying to be polite and whatever. You're trying to be nice. You want to earn their compliance and respect and whatever. As opposed to saying like, hey, sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the car. Mitigating like that, you're asking for problems where you go like, would you mind stepping out of the car? Yeah, I do mind. All right, get out. It's like, no, I just said no. Like you gave me the option to say no, and I said no, and I'm going to dig my heels in on that.
Now we're playing the game.
Those are the real tactical implications that Jim is talking about. And it's like we mentioned the parenting examples 100%. And it goes both ways. So like I mentioned the example of talking to your boss. You want to, as a leader, you want to facilitate people being able to say like, hey, if you need something by a certain day, just say so, right? This goes the other direction as well, though. If you're a leader and you say you have something like an open door policy, but then you flame people when they take advantage of it, that's a problem. One of my favorite examples, and by favorite, I mean I fucking hate it, is when there's like a meeting.
That was mitigating speech, right?
And
it's your favorite example.
Yeah. There's like a meeting and the bosses go like, hey guys, this is what I'm thinking. Like, what do you think? And
you want to hear your opinion in my voice. Oh, okay. Got it. Yeah.
And that's
I've fallen for that one.
So like my question in my head, at least, is always, are you asking me for input or are you telling me what we're going to do? Right. Like that's, and if you're not careful, right, you're going to end up just stepping on your own dick. You're going to be like, I think that's a stupid idea, sir. And they'll be like, well, that's what we're doing. You're like, oh, fuck. So again, it kind of goes both directions. Like if you're asked for your input in this sense, in a meeting, this is an idea that I had. What do you guys think? Be careful mitigating too much. If you want to express your dissent, then say so. I disagree. I think that's a short-sighted idea. Here's why. And if you're a leader, don't go in there and tell me that you're asking for input if really you're not going to take my input. You're wasting my time and my breath and my energy, and you're going to wear my patience down. Like if you're just hoping that I'm going to agree with you, if it doesn't matter, then don't ask for my input. Just tell me, hey, this is the new direction. This is what we're going to do. This is what I've decided. I think it's great when leaders want to get input from their people. But if you're not going to take it into account, don't waste my time with it. And so what this all boils down to from a leadership concept is whether it's tactical or just in a strategic or planning type of sense, we're trying to establish a culture where people can speak freely without fear of punishment or conflict. It doesn't mean that we can't have conflict, right? It just means that we're not going to get in trouble for saying what we think needs to be said. We're willing to have those difficult conversations, courageous conversations, you might have heard it called, right? There's a time and a place to mitigate and to be polite and be diplomatic. We're not discounting that at all. But you need to recognize from a tactical perspective that that is inefficient and it costs time and patience and all of those things. And if you don't have those in a crisis, for example, efficiency counts. So say what needs to be said. Be direct. Authority is an important thing, but if you're deferential to authority when you communicate, you're not maybe being part of the solution. You may be contributing to the problem. I think that's all I got.
to kind of bring this full circle, talking about cross domain, like between law enforcement, medical, and aviation. My aunt professionally handles medical malpractice cases, and she gave me a book once called "Why Hospitals Should Fly" by a guy named John Nance. And it may not change your life, but kind of the point of the book was this exact same like cross domain thing. You know, how can a nurse talk to a doctor if the doctor is giving the nurse bad direction? Like, do you think that's ever happened? Like, oh yeah. And that's kind of the point of the book is applying aviation crew resource management to at least that world. And I'm not saying aviation.
Let me just to like point out like the toxic sort of, I don't know, inversion of that.
Yeah,
is like where the nurse is like, all right, I'm only going to do explicitly, specifically, exactly what the doctor tells me and nothing else. Like, well, you didn't tell me to do that, so like. Well, I didn't tell you to not treat your patients in a caring and compassionate manner, to be clear. Like,
yeah,
you can go both directions.
That can go anytime you have a group of people, that group of people can take it every possible different way. It's fascinating to watch group dynamics,
especially when it's just like a raw communication thing.
Yep. Or cross-cultural, right? One's from one language, cultural background.
A lot. In medicine, a lot, for sure.
Or socioeconomic background, you see all kinds of things. So if you're thinking cross-domain, that might be a good book to take a look at. Why Hospitals Should Fly. This is interesting stuff, but I want to emphasize, this is the tactical stuff. This is the difference between winning and losing is this. So
especially when it comes to working in teams. And like, that active killer event that you go to, or the hostage rescue that you're going to do, or whatever, that's not a one-man show in a lot of cases. An active killer response could be a one-man show when it comes to that initial, like, first guy gets there, close with, kill the dude. To be clear, I'm fully in favor of that being a one-man show if it needs to be. I'm here for it. But as that event unfolds and people need to get help and medical care rolls in and there's an investigation and all these things, that is never going to be a one-man show. Those are always a clusterfuck. And there's very, very real tactical implications in the way that we communicate with each other, whether it's on the radio or not. And that is not something that you want to wait for game day to figure out. That's something that needs to be embedded into your culture in your day-to-day, in your 9-to-5 stuff.
I think that's all I got. Be safe out there, be smart out there, and use words wisely.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.